Good evening, everyone. We are now going to discuss How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, Chapter 5. And that chapter is entitled Africa's Contribution to the Capitalist Development of Europe, the Colonial Period. And again, this is a book by Walter Rodney, and my name is Deborah Greenwood. During colonization, resources from Africa supported the metropolitan sector of Europe, meaning that Europe became developed while Africa became underdeveloped. One of the ways this was done was to severely depress the wages of the colonized people. In fact, they were depressed so much that people could hardly live. They really weren't livable. So how was it that Europeans were able to so thoroughly exploit African workers? Well, one was their political power, the political power of the colonists, and you'll see more on that later in terms of how they ignored laws. There was also a lack of cohesion among the African workers. The workforce was small, it was dispersed, and it was unstable due to the tendency of the workforce to migrate. An example of racism that was meted out to African workers comes from a gold mine disaster that took place in 1934. The dependents of the mine workers who were killed were only given 3 pounds. So who were the main beneficiaries of colonialism? The main ones were shareholders. These folks made massive dividends from minerals and resources such as gold, diamonds, manganese, and uranium. In the 1970s, a big deal was made about the Krugerrand out of South Africa. The Krugerrand appeared in 1936, and after protests erupted, I think, all over the world. I know we did it in the U.S. in the 70s, but after the protests, it was banned in 1985. Now, this was after reaching a distribution of like 90% of gold coins in 1980. It was allowed back in 1994, and the Krugerrand is still available today. And I think the price of the coin is over $1,000. Other beneficiaries of colonialism were companies such as De Beers Consolidated Mines. In the 1950s, they made profits between 26 to 29 million. And that's 1950s. That's a lot of money. There were also people who benefited from agriculture. And what happened is that many of the African farmers had their land stolen, and that land was then turned around and sold to whites at very low prices. But those profits were a little less robust than the mining profits. An example of land theft can be found with Firestone. In 1926, they bought 1 million acres of land, probably in Liberia, at 6 cents an acre, and that cost amounted to only about 1% of the value of rubber that they exported that year. So why didn't African farmers flourish? I mean, after all, they had great land, they had skills, they knew how to work the land. So what was holding them back? African farmers faced many challenges. One of the challenges had to do with the intermediaries that emerged in the farming industry. In West Africa, those intermediaries usually came from Lebanon or Syria, and they managed the cotton gins. In East Africa, the intermediaries were typically Indians or Arabs, and their specialty was in selling the cash crops. And what happened is that the African farmers were given the very limited job of planting the crops, raising the crops, harvesting the crops, and then turning the crops over to the middlemen. They were cash crop peasants, and they had very little, if any, capital of their own. So they were kind of stuck in that role. Other challenges of African farmers who were actually peasants, they were forced to grow cash crops, not crops that they might have wanted to do. They might have wanted to diversify, but they had to grow cash crops for the colonists. And as a result, they never had any capital. They were forced to go from one cash crop to another. Again, not having any capital, they had no capital reserves. There was nothing they could save. If problems arose, such as needing money to help take care of a problem with their crops, they had to borrow that money. And very little money was available for them to even pay their taxes or buy necessities. So they wound up mortgaging their future to the middlemen. So what we find is that the colonists went from engaging in the slave trade to what we can consider colonial trading. So instead of moving people, they began moving goods. And some of those new commodities included ground nuts, palm oil, and minerals. And United Africa Company was a large British company that was a subsidiary of Unilever. But even with that large company, France was the most notorious of the colonial traders. As it turned out, there were some farmers that actually preferred to grow cash crops. And apparently they made maybe a little more money than some of the other farmers because they could then in turn purchase European goods, whereas others were in fact forced to grow these cash crops. And knowing that peasants could grow their own food, colonists did not feel obligated to pay fair prices for crops. They really kept those prices depressed. And just as a little aside, per the National Geographic website, there are actually 6 types of crops that are currently grown. Crops for human consumption or food, feed crops which go to livestock, fiber crops which are used for making things like textiles and paper products, things like cotton and hemp, those kinds of crops. Consumption of oil for human or industrial use. So you have oil crops. You have ornamental crops, and those would be things that you would use in your landscape gardening, things like flowers or different kinds of bushes, small trees. And you have your industrial crops, and these were things like rubber, which would be used in manufacturing. The French came up with a brilliantly evil scheme to control the peasants. They developed things called cooperative societies, and they made the farmers join these societies. The farmers were then forced to grow certain crops that the French wanted them to grow, and then the farmers in turn had to accept whatever price the French decided to pay them. Adding insult to injury, after the Depression, during World War II, the colonists made Africans fight for their freedom, their meaning the colonists' freedom, because Africa really wasn't a player or a factor during World War II. And this, of course, impacted production such that in 1939, colonies could only buy 60% of the manufactured goods that they produced compared to what they were able to do between like 1870 and 1880. So that was a tough time for them, but of course they found a way to seek the solution through the role of Africans. Colonial shipping companies emerged because they had to get these raw materials out of Africa and to places where they could be processed, manufactured, whatever. The largest shipping companies tended to be British, and these folks made super profits. Um, and this helped to stimulate industry and trade. In addition to transporting raw materials and those kinds of goods, they also delivered mail and helped the Navy during the war times. So you might think that the African farmers or peasants might benefit since their products were being exported, but the peasants had no control or bargaining power over the freight rates that were paid. In fact, if an African peasant sent something to another land, they actually paid more than the citizens in, say, Europe, for example. And of course, they had no access to bank loans. So the exploitation just gets piled on and piled on and piled on. So since these folks were making all this money, they had to have banks to put the money in. And the first banks to emerge were I'm not going to say this in good French, Banque de Senegal, and that was established in circa 1853. And as an offshoot of a shipping firm, the Bank of British West Africa was also established, in one of the first ones to be established on the continent. And once they saw the volume of transactions increase in these banks, then the large banking houses got involved and they started merging with these small and independent banks. So you saw the Banque de Senegal merge with the Banque de l'Afrique Occidentale, and the Bank of Indochina was actually created by several powerful metropolitan French banks. So not only did Africans experience exploitation through agriculture and shipping, just the administration of the colonies functioned as another way that Africans were exploited. Um, the colonial administration existed to protect the national interests of the countries who were colonizing Africa. Sometimes conflicts would arise among these greedy nations, and their role was really to guarantee maximal exploitation and, of course, the imposition of law and order so that the people who were being exploited would not rise up and protest against it. There were three main aims in the colonies: to make the most money possible, um, and levy taxes on the people that you're exploiting, and also levy customs duties uh, to help build up your monetary reserves. So they did things like make the workers in the African colonies pay for the governor's mansions and the police and security forces, the very ones who oppressed them. They were also forced to pay for the armed services used to conquer Africa. I mean, it just gets more and more egregious the more we get into this. A white settler in Kenya is quoted as having said about the African, "We have stolen his land, now we must steal his limbs." And of course, he's referring to the actions that were taken in order to crush African resistance to the vast exploitation and oppression by the Europe colonists. Another example of just how exploitative these people were. First, notice that they put their names on the lands of the people of Africa, the French Equatorial Africa. And what happened is that the Manja people, who were hunters, were banned from hunting, and instead they were forced into cotton cultivation. Word on the European names in Africa, Maj, has a project that he has designed and is working on, and to encourage people to identify the original names of places in Africa and to restore those original names. And I think it's a great way to show resistance to the lingering effects of colonialism. Bravo, Maj. But for the colonists, paying low wages weren't enough. They found a way to force African workers to work for free. And what they did is that they came up with the scheme of having colonial public works. So Africans were forced to do such things as build castles for the governor, prisons for the Africans, barracks for the troops, roads, railways, and ports. In Sierra Leone, for example, many died from laying the railroad track due to the appalling conditions. And when I went to the Railroad Museum in Freeport in 2018, I don't remember any mention of these deaths as they recounted the history of the railroad, nor did they give an adequate explanation for why that railroad was closed down in around 1970. Now, of course, these people were so out of control. I guess there was some outcry about the way Africans were being treated in their own country. And so we saw some laws emerge, such as the Native Authority Ordinance, which restricted compulsory labor. And this was instituted in 1923. And in 1930, you had the International Forced Labor Convention, and all colonial powers signed on this. But of course, they just ignored it. They signed it and they didn't do one thing to respect these laws. And once again, the French were among the worst in that they forced African males to enlist in their army, and then after the African men performed their duties, they were then used as unpaid laborers. Clearly, Africans were not considered people whose lives, whose rights these people had any obligation to consider. For example, the Portuguese would take Angolans and Mozambicans and send them to work in South African mines. And the Portuguese were paid for each worker that they provided. Of course, they showed no concern for the miners' family situation. You know, they might have had children, they may have had a pregnant spouse, they may have had sick parents. Didn't matter. They had to go to the mines. And I'm sure they weren't paid more for being sent away. So in this next section, we'll take a look at the impact of colonization on international currency. Arthur Creech Jones and Oliver Littleton were major figures in British colonial policy making. In the 1950s, they even admitted that Britain was living on the dollar earnings of the colonies. They didn't have to tap into their reserves at all to meet their financial obligations. So how did this happen? Well, what happened is that the British issued coins and notes through private banks, and these coins and notes were backed by sterling reserves. And after the establishment of the West African Currency Board, the East African Currency Board, the currency boards took over this function. So the colony earned foreign exchange via their exports, and the earnings were held in Britain in pounds sterling. An equivalent amount of local currency, East or West Africa, was issued for circulation in the respective colonies. The sterling was then invested in British government stock, which earned more profit for Britain. And you see who's missing from the equation, who doesn't benefit at all from this scheme. So the contributions of colonies to the sterling reserves were a gift to the British. Even a small country like Sierra Leone reached sterling reserves of 60 million pounds. In fact, in 1955, the Brits held 210 million pounds derived from the sale of cocoa and minerals from the Gold Coast. In 1945, Africa's total contribution to Britain's sterling balances was 446 million pounds. And by 1955, that went up their contributions went up to more than half of the total gold and dollar reserves of Britain and the Commonwealth. So Britain was living on the dollar earnings of the colonies. And of course, it wasn't just Britain that had this financial scheme. The Congo actually financed all the expenditures of the Belgian government in London, their diplomatic service and their armed services. In fact, they built up reserves of 40 million pounds, and the Belgian government in London didn't have to borrow 1 shilling or dollar, and their gold reserve was intact. Now, during colonialism, there were many advances going on in the world. Technological advances such as the miniaturization of electronic equipment, improvements in telecommunications, and development of computers. Of course, new petrochemicals were created, and the profits from colonialism supported scientific research, and some of the raw materials that they got from the colonies were used to advance instruments of war. So you see, Africa was instrumental to all of this. Colonialism created jobs in Europe, created jobs in North America, as we just saw, provided financial benefit to governments. And as if that wasn't enough, even the precious artifacts of Africa were stolen and taken to European museums. The domination of Africa was almost complete just in terms of its scope. But the last chapter in our book will examine the role of education, women, and the church during colonialism. And this last chapter is a humdinger. Thanks for your attention, and I hope you're enjoying, well, it's not enjoyable material, but I hope that you're enjoying the learning that's going on during these series of presentations.